Hey there folks, MIDI and USB on the MODX and MONTAGE. What's the deal? You can only use one or the other, not both together. But is that really the case? What if I could show you a way to get around this so-called limitation? Sound interesting? Then keep watching. In today's setups, most people are using a mix of hardware synths, like these, and VST software synths, such as Omnisphere that I have on the screen at the moment. But on your MODX or MONTAGE, if you want to control external hardware synthesizers that are connected to it via good old-fashioned MIDI cables, then you have to go into the utility settings and enable MIDI, as shown on the screen in the corner. But then, if you want to control or play a VST, you have to go back into the utility screen and choose USB, as shown on the screen in the corner now. So, as I said at the start, this means you can only use one or the other, MIDI or USB. This also means that you can't layer and split hardware and software synths on the MODX at the same time, because you can't use MIDI and USB at the same time. But in one of my recent videos, I showed you how the zone master function works for the MODX and MONTAGE, and how I had a live set up on my MODX that enables me to trigger any one of my hardware or any one of my software synths at the push of a button without having to swap between MIDI and USB in the utility section, and how I could layer both hardware and software synths together, combining them seamlessly. But how then is this possible if I can't use MIDI and USB at the same time? Let me show you. Here is my DAW template. I'm using Cubase here with all my tracks set up, and in order for the VSTs to work seamlessly, I have them all armed in the DAW. Here's my MODX utility screen with the MIDI in-out section set to MIDI, and here's the live set on my MODX with all my hardware and software synths assigned by MIDI channel and enabled by the Zone Master function. For detailed info on the Zone Master function and my DAW template, I'll leave links to videos in the description down below that go into these in more detail. Now, for example, if I choose Performance 2 in my live set, it will trigger my Matrix Brute synthesizer. And if I choose Performance 3, it'll play my Deep Mind. But if I choose, say, Performance 11, it will play my Spectrasonics VST on the computer. Or Performance 13 will play my Korg Polysix VST on the computer. So how am I playing both hardware synths and software synths whilst the MODX is still in MIDI mode? Well, the answer is a MIDI interface, which in my case is my TR-8S drum machine. You see, I discovered something purely by accident and hadn't realised what I'd stumbled across until someone in the comments asked me the question how I was doing this. For me, it just worked, and I hadn't questioned how or why it was working. Here's a simplified view of my setup. There's a lot of other gear and connections, but here I'm just focusing on the MODX signal flow. The MODX MIDI out goes into the TR-8S drum machine. The TR-8S then goes to a thru box. The thru box then goes to all my hardware, including back to the MODX. The TR-8S is then also connected to the computer via USB, and just for clarity, every other bit of gear, including the MODX, is also connected to the computer via USB. But here I've just shown the TR-8S as it's the main bit we're interested in. What I didn't realise was that my TR-8S drum machine was also acting as a MIDI interface, allowing the MODX to communicate with the computer through its 5-pin MIDI connection via the TR-8S drum machine. If you happen to have a TR-8S, in the utility menu there is a function called USB MIDI thru, which when turned on, allows anything connected to the MIDI ports on the TR8S to communicate with the computer using the TR8S's USB connection. In my DAW template, for all my VSTs, I then have the inputs set as all MIDI inputs. And in the MIDI port setup of Cubase, I have all my hardware synths, MIDI keyboards, and the TR8S drum machine set to be active in the all MIDI inputs column. What this means is my MODX can now actually play my software VSTs while it's in MIDI mode, as they are actually receiving the signal from the 5-pin MIDI out of the MODX, going into the TR8S, and then using the MIDI interface functionality on the TR8S, it's going to the computer from the TR8S USB. And in your DAW, instead of choosing the synthesizer itself as the input, you would choose whatever is acting as your MIDI interface as the input, the TR8S drum machine in this case. Also, as mentioned earlier, this allows me to combine both hardware synths and software synths together in layers or splits directly on the MODX, which is a real game changer for how I use my synths. Ordinarily, that wouldn't be possible, but now it is. Now, I know I said at the start how to use MIDI and USB at the same time. Well, in reality, we're not, but the end result is the same as if we were. What's actually happening is we're only using the 5-pin MIDI out from the MODX. But what we are doing is using the TR8S drum machine as a MIDI interface to turn that 5-pin MIDI signal into a USB MIDI signal so that we can play the VST software synths whilst at the same time still being able to play the hardware synths. In effect, it's no different really to if you have old synthesizers without USB connections and you use a MIDI interface to connect their 5-pin MIDI to that, and then the MIDI interface to the computer with a USB. In a way, we're sort of replicating that old school way of doing things. And when it comes to in your DAW, instead of choosing the synthesizer itself as the input, you would choose the MIDI interface as the input, in this case the TR8S drum machine. The only caveat here is that in my setup I'm only sending the MIDI out from the MODX to the computer. There's no MIDI signal going from the computer back to the MODX whilst it's in MIDI mode. Therefore, for any MIDI data that I've recorded into my DAW using the MODX's own internal sound engine, if I want to play that back and have the MIDI data trigger the sounds on the MODX, then I do need to be in USB mode. However, if you're lucky enough to have an all-singing, all-dancing MIDI interface, like a Mio XL or an MRCC, and have both the MIDI in and the MIDI out of the MODX connected to your MIDI interface, then everything works whilst in MIDI mode, whether recording or playing back the MIDI data. So that's it. That's how I can play both hardware synths and software synths directly from my MODX, all whilst in MIDI mode, without having to go into the utility section and swap backwards and forwards between MIDI and USB. The big question is then, how do you do this, especially if you haven't got a TR8S drum machine? Well, if you've got any form of MIDI interface, then this will be possible. As I mentioned earlier, just connect the MIDI out from the MODX to the MIDI interface, and then in your DAW, choose the MIDI interface as the input for all of your VSTs rather than the MODX. Then you too can play VSTs while still in MIDI mode on the MODX, enabling you to seamlessly swap between hardware and software without having to muck about in the utility section. And I know that that works because I've tried it. Instead of running my MODX MIDI out to the drum machine, I connected the MIDI out from my MODX to my Behringer audio interface, and then in my DAW I chose the Behringer audio interface as the input for my VSTs, and everything worked perfectly. Well, that's about it. That's how to control hardware and software synths at the same time on your MODX or Montage, all whilst staying in MIDI mode. As I say, for me, this was a real game changer, and maybe for you as well, as it opens up a whole new load of possibilities on how you can combine all your gear together. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have, please don't forget to like, subscribe and ring that bell, as it really is appreciated. And if you have any questions, then please leave them in the comments and I will get back to you. Indeed, any other comments or feedback are of course gratefully received. Also, please check out the playlists on my channel, as there's a whole host of videos on there that you may well find useful. But for now, I've been Graham, take care and catch you later.